Hey guys, welcome back to Boneshaker. Today I'll work on the layout of the coaster as well as some terrain editing, because both are really some of the main additions in Alpha 2 and I haven't really had time to play around with them quite yet. And I really like the way that the new coaster creator is in Alpha 2.2, and of course the terrain editor from Alpha 2 is a really big and great addition, so I'll definitely be able to get some good practice with that as well. But I'll also be doing a couple of more off-topic stuff in the video that I couldn't stop myself from doing, like some small scenery objects, like a small prototype steam engine at the end of this video, and this quick bridge I wanted to have for the queue at the entrance of the station. I know it seems quite awkward that this is where the queue enters the station, since it's not exactly the front of the building, but I just wanted to have it over here to have more space for the queue to actually sort of sweep through the area of the coaster and leave the exit path just as a quick path, which also looks quite good from the front, but just quickly connects to the rest of the park. And what I also really wanted to do here is to build this quick bridge over here, which is... I'll actually get into many bridges throughout this coaster. I think I'll get like 3 or 4 bridges, and that's not even counting what the future lift hill is gonna be like. Basically because, for one, they're just really fun to make, and it's just a really good practice of getting all sorts of different little bridge designs in with these sort of industrial looks, because it quite honestly is also a really good way to get some industrial looking scenery into the landscape, but it's also something I want to get in here just to have a bit more depth in the landscape itself, make it a bit more playful, because I think it's just a lot more interesting to have bridges going on and different height levels of paths and roller coasters that also sort of dive underneath each other and go over each other. Things like that to just make the entire landscape a bit more, well, interesting to look at in that respect. I also figured I could try to get a quick cog in here, but that didn't quite work, so I put that aside. Actually, I might get back to it at some point in the future. I do intend to have a lot of gears and cogs and pipes at some point in the future. But what I should say though, and this is quite a painful thing that makes me feel a bit sad face, because Alpha 2.2 actually had a bug fix, and I am not entirely happy with that bug fix. It's basically fixed the bug which I talked about in the last video, and sort of felt bad that I didn't show off how to do it. It was the bug that if you take an object and rotate it using the 3-axis gizmo and then select a wall, you can actually get walls in all sorts of rotations which they're not meant for. So you could get diagonal walls and angled walls and stuff like that. But that was obviously not the intention, so they actually took that bug out of Alpha 2.2, but that was pretty much the bug that I was intending to use and pretty much relied on for this entire idea of a steampunk coaster, because it would allow me to get pipes in all sorts of directions. And now that that bug isn't here anymore, it'll be a bit harder to get like all of those different pipes and cogs into different sections of the coaster. But I do still want to keep going with this thing and see what can still, well, be made out of this anyway. Because there is one little and very nice thing that is still sort of buggy about that entire bug fix, which is that if you already have a building which uses that bug to get an object in a rotation which it's not supposed to be in, you can actually just copy that building over and duplicate it and have it the same copy with the same rotation which was supposed to be fixed. And I hope they're not going to fix that, because I'm gonna have to rely on that to actually copy over the few horizontal pipes that I laid down in the last episode into all sorts of pipes that I want to make in the future. So I definitely want to get into some of that real industrial scenery around the roller coaster, but in this episode I'll focus just on the layout of the coaster, or mostly on the layout of the coaster and the terrain around it, because this is going to be very much a terrain conforming coaster. It's quite inspired by the Vekoma mine train coasters, especially the later versions like Big Grizzly Runaway Mine Train or Expedition Everest. Things like that, although on a much smaller scale. I would say much more on a scale of the Seven Dwarfs Mine Train, for instance, in Disneyland. If it's not Disney Magic Kingdom, I actually completely forgot which park it's located in. But yeah, that's the sort of idea that I'm going for. It's going to be quite a family ride. So you can see it's not that tall, it's not going to have any inversions or anything like that. It's just going to have those typical Vekoma sort of swoops around, well, the terrain and some scenery, and just be quite a relaxed ride in general. And it's going to focus mostly on scenery. Though that said, I do think the way that the coaster layout is built is quite important for this, especially given how prominent the coaster is in this case, since it is quite a compact coaster and it interacts a lot with the terrain and the paths. So one sort of thing that I also really wanted to make sure with this coaster was that the layout not only rides well, I guess, but also looks good and could work well with the scenery around it. And so it's going to be quite compact, have a lot of helixes, and as you can already see, a lot of parts where it goes underneath itself or underneath paths or over paths, stuff like that. It's quite dense in terms of not just how compact the layout is, but also how much it interacts with the surroundings. I also wanted to give it that very dark, sort of metallic-ish red color. I'm not entirely sure if there's a specific name for this shade of red. There probably is, but I don't know exactly what it would be. But yeah, I think it is a good way to get a sort of steampunk vibe to the coaster and also get some shades of red into this area, because at the moment there's no way to recolor any scenery pieces, and many of the scenery pieces are very blue, white, brownish, and there's no real shades of red in there at all. So I kind of wanted to get that in the coaster, or the general scenery with the coaster tracks and also the paths, as you can see. And as for the choice of the coaster track and terrain, that is just kind of something that makes no sense. It's intended to be a Vekoma Mine Train-like coaster, not exactly a B&M or Giovanola track. And I just figured a Giovanola Hyper would work quite well, because it kind of has like the large family coaster trains to it, and it looks a little bit steampunk-ish as well, I feel. At least more steampunkian than any of the other coaster trains do, so that's why I figured a hypercoaster would be most fitting, but this is definitely not a hypercoaster in the way that it's laid out, and kind of wish we would have some Vekoma things. At least I'm still crossing my fingers for some point in the future. Anyway, in this last section of the coaster, I wanted to let it dip into a small valley and actually go underneath the paths, which is also done for just a couple of reasons. It's just a really nice way to get the path to go over the roller coaster, which I figured would just be really cool over there, and also a nice way to remain the coaster to have some speed throughout the layout. As you can probably see right now, it makes the layout pretty fine, which I was pretty glad about, given that I didn't test it before up to this point. But it's like a way to get the coaster to not really lose any speed, since the higher parts never really go down that much, and the last part really goes down a lot lower than the station. So it just kind of remains quick throughout the entire ride, and then just before the station it goes up quite a lot and should go into the brakes quite smoothly, which is a good way to keep it going for quite a long time while still not making it too intense, since it is a family coaster after all. And yeah, this will just be one quick little dip into the valley, and then it's gonna run into the brake run, where I won't have any transfer tracks or anything like that though, because there is not entirely any space left for it, which is kind of awkward. I might want to look at it at some point in the future, but yeah, this is the finished layout of the coaster at the moment. Though I should definitely note, even though this is going to be more or less the final layout after some smooth, it's definitely not going to be the final look of this coaster, and the terraforming is also not going to be the final look of what the scenery around the coaster is going to look like, in terms of it being built around a mountain and kind of in a very small canyon as well, since I do want to use a lot of rock work still to move toward the coaster, which I do realize is not going to be as easy as just filling it up with some terraforming, which is also kind of strange because it's been newly added to the game, and I might as well make use of the terrain editing, but I actually rather want to make use of the rocks instead, because you can just get them to be closer to the track, and I really want it to be very terrain conforming, that it follows the rocks all the time, but I do want to mix the sort of scenery rocks with the terraforming just to get some slightly different textures and slightly different sort of surfaces in here, and not have everything look like exactly the same rock. But yeah, I will add a lot of scenery onto this mountain, so this is definitely not going to be the final look of the terraforming or the scenery or the way in which the coaster is going to look in general. This is just sort of the very naked layout at the moment. And the queue, I kind of want the queue to just sweep along this area and have some like scenery interaction and interaction with the coaster over there. And I'm not entirely sure if I actually want to have like a real zigzag pattern underneath the building or anything like that at any point in the queue line. It's already pretty lengthy at that point, and I think it should be more or less fine this way. I'll still have to look into that in the future though. I'm not entirely sure what I'm gonna do with that corner of this map. Now for the lift hill, since it's a really prominent feature of this coaster and also the one that you kind of see most from all sort of angles that you can look at the coaster from, especially from the path, I really wanted to make the lift hill sort of part of the scenery, as for instance Baron 1898 does as well, and actually give it a bit of a like industrial sort of lift hill with not the in-game supports but some metallic sort of hybrid wooden supports with some wooden catwalks as well, just to make it look a little bit more interesting and unique and set it apart from the rest of the track of the coaster. And I might do some other stuff with it in the future as well, like put a small roof on the top of the lift hill and things like that. I do have some plans to put like a tower on top of this little mountain and make like a proper weenie for the top of this lift hill, but I'm not entirely sure when I'm actually gonna go into that. And at the moment I just wanted to play it safe for an episode and just get into the details that I knew for sure how I wanted to get them and how they would work out in the end. I also wanted to have this sort of quick little protection alongside this part of the coaster, not just because I obviously needed to fence that off, because otherwise the track is just way too close to the path and people could just climb onto the track, and you don't really want people to do that, and I do want to have some safety measures. And it also just kind of looks cool to have that sort of overhang which sticks out of the mountain and lets the coaster sort of semi get into a little cave before it dips out again and does that little helix. And I also wanted to do a bit of terrain painting over here. I'm not going to get into too complex of terrain painting, but I just wanted to get a bit of a darker texture, get some darker grass, and definitely get some of that dark rock sort of texture. I do find that the textures at the moment, even though they're very limited, they work really well if you mix them. So I can really recommend setting the intensity very low and just sort of spraying some rock work onto grass to create like some slightly darker grass, which actually works quite well, especially with this sort of industrial gritty theme. Or mix the grass with sand with like a very slight intensity on the sand, just get some slightly lighter grass. Or yeah, you can kind of mix them in all sorts of ways if you keep the intensity quite low, which is quite a fun thing to play around and actually gives you some very different looking textures from just what the game very strictly gives you. Now over here I wanted to have this quick little bridge over this part where the coaster dives underneath the path, does a little helix and dives back into the path, or underneath the path I should say, which is quite inspired actually by Big Grizzly Runaway Mine Train in Hong Kong. If you don't know about that coaster, it's a really cool mine train coaster made by Vekoma, and it's actually a mine train coaster which has a backward section as well, and it just has like an amazing sort of way in which it follows the terrain and interacts with the path and the scenery, and that's, in that way, it's sort of an inspiration here, even though the theme is completely different and the layout is too. It's sort of that real interactive aspect that I want to get in here as well. I also really want to make this coaster look charming in a way, which is a really strange sort of goal to have for a coaster, but I don't exactly want to make something really impressive or large or epic or anything like this. It's just a sort of small experiment to make something that's like small and charming and unique, which I find is actually the hardest sort of thing to do, not just because what is charming and what isn't is sort of subjective and more or less based on my own judgment here. It's just that making something really large and impressive and epic is still something you can kind of follow some rules or guides for, but there is no sort of guide on how to make something look charming. It's just, there is no real approach to it. It's really hard to really get that across, and that's what I really am trying to do with this coaster, to make something that really has its own sort of signature style. And instead of being like this very large grand coaster, it's just a small family coaster with some simple scenery, or simple, maybe I do mix a lot of elements in here, but like nothing that's completely very vast or massive. and yeah, make that look just in a way like a charming little family coaster. That's basically the objective, and in that way I feel like this is much harder to do than making any sort of very large spectacular ride, just because there is no way to really get it done right except for what you sort of feel should be done and what you sort of feel is right, and really have to kind of follow, well, your instincts with that, I guess. Anyway, that's just a little bit of stuff which I wanted to talk about, but I have no idea what you're actually going to do with that information. I also wanted to make a quick steam engine over here, which is not so much like a serious sort of scenery project over here, but just something that I quickly wanted to test as a little prototype, to mess around with the pipes a bit more and try to make that wheel of the steam engine especially actually work somehow, and of course also sort of well, put the main theme of this coaster, because it is steampunk and it revolves around steam engine technology, more or less in the center sort of focal point of this entire landscape, and it's definitely going to be visible from many different areas. So yeah, I just wanted to accentuate this theme and this area with a little steampunk engine, or steam engine I should say, perhaps a bit in a steampunk-ish style. It's also something that I figured would work quite well, since I wanted to have some sort of scenery piece over here, but obviously since this is right in front of the lift hill, I didn't want to make anything that's very tall, or I would more or less break the perspective that I have over here. So I just wanted to have something that's very small and low, but could still work quite well as a sort of center point scenery piece here. And I think it works quite well to have this little steampunk machinery over here in the middle of it, and actually picked up quite a few ideas that I still have to do on how you can make some cogs and gears, because there definitely are many ways to get around that with the current pieces, and I might actually make some pipes out of that like little wooden piece, which I think should be quite feasible and actually a good way to get some brass pipes. So I think that's something I want to mess around with in the next episode, though that's way too early in the video to talk about that. I am running out of the time-lapse though, but I do still have some small real-time parts that I do want to show off a bit, to at least show what the layout looks like in its full glory at the moment. So this is what it looks like. It's not that tall, as you can see, it is pretty small, but it still goes on for quite a while and has like really that sort of higher section, a middle section and a lower section where it dives underneath the path. And this is what it looks like from the path area in general, with the steam engine in front of it. But there is still a lot to add. Like at the moment it looks quite empty, and I really want to add machinery and rocks and all sorts of stuff all around the track, and not leave it as bare as it is at the moment. And for a final overview of what it looks like, this is it. So thank you guys for watching, and I hope to see you guys in the next episode.